Finite man struggles to know the infinite. To land, the man born from nothing or creation ex nihilo wishes to return to nothing, opposed to a transcendental God that cannot die and whom mankind can never truly know. Thirsting for his own annihilation, which is similar to capitalism, as Marx noted, having the seeds built in it to sow its own sense of self-destruction. Techno-capital functions on the basis of transgression itself, tied to Bataille's notion of the accursed share, where we delight ourselves to death. Tolkien's artistic enchantment is opposed to technical magic, which seeks to alter the physical world. Enchantment is meant to counter the disenchantment of the modern world, which uses technique or technical magic for power-based purposes. Christ's resurrection is the ultimate fairy story to Tolkien, a eucatastrophe, whereby hope and light is restored just after being lost to darkness, seen via Christ's death and rebirth. The decay in Middle-earth is due to the corruption of Morgoth, making things imperfect, as noted later with the departure of the elves from Middle-earth, where Morgoth's ring itself is seen as a metaphor for all of Middle-earth due to its corrupted state of existence, a very Gnostic and Christian idea. While not an allegory, since Tolkien hated allegories due to their definitive or one-sided interpretations, it connects ultimately back to man's industrial and corruptible power-based pursuits, as well as the fall of man out of the Garden of Eden, tied to the notion of original sin in the Catholic sense. Techno-capital links back to not only industrial man and automation, but to the very notion of technique itself and thus technical magic, acting in opposition to artistic enchantment. In short, Land uses and relies upon technical magic in his philosophy on techno-capital, leading to further disenchantment that further alters the physical world, while Tolkien keeps two artistic forms of enchantment kept to the fairy story of Christ. One advocates for man while the other advocates for the technical machine. We can further see distinctions between Tolkien and Land when analyzing Nietzsche, as well as Tolkien's appreciation for St. Thomas Aquinas. As a Catholic, Tolkien disliked the idealist frameworks of both Hegel and Kant. He believed instead in the realist notion that objective reality exists outside of the mind. Adhering to St. Thomas Aquinas, intellect merely abstracts these universal concepts, which, to Aquinas, since he did not adhere to nominalism, are not merely labels. In other words, these concepts correspond to reality itself, understood via our senses, hence why Aquinas attempted to prove God's existence through his 5 proofs. This would be opposed to the idealism of, say, Kant's transcendental idealism, where Kant's noumenal realm functions outside of sense perception, making a distinct split between phenomenon and noumenon. As such, while one adheres to reason as a means to understand reality, the other, i.e. Kant, notes how reason has its limits. As such, it should be noted that Tolkien took an objective view of reality as opposed to a subjective one. Because of this, he was critical of Kant and his noumenal realm, as well as Hegel. Idealism and realism are specific philosophical terms. While the idealist believes reality is reliant upon consciousness, making it fundamentally a working of the mind, the realist believes reality objectively exists and is not reliant upon consciousness to exist. While Land adheres to Kant's transcendental, he remains a materialistic thinker where only physical matter is real. While Land adheres to Kant's transcendental philosophy, Land is no idealist, he is a materialist. What I think Land does best is take certain idealist ideas and essentially converts them into a materialist framework, i.e., using the transcendental in a non-traditionally idealist manner. Land does this well when looking to Nietzsche and Nietzsche's own dislike for Kant and Hegel's traditional idealism, relying upon the will to power instead, which forces one to actively engage and create, like a poet, with the world. Conversely, the idealist, like the Christian, would passively not engage with the world, making them cowardly to Nietzsche. In short, Nietzsche rejected the transcendental. As such, in Fang Noumena, we see Land advocate for a shamanic version of Nietzsche where the transcendental can be appreciated in a non-traditional or material framework. But first, let us look to alchemic equivalence, a symmetrical form of above and below, and how it ties into the symbolic archetype of death and rebirth. As we will see, while Land believes in death and rebirth, it will be an inhuman and asymmetrical rebirth via AI, where deterritorialization, runaway, escapes symmetrical humans, and thus ordered systems, where Kant's transcendental still functions, albeit in a materialistic framework, where, remember, in Fang Noumena, fanged is in reference to Marx's notion of capital being dead labor that sucks vampirically upon living labor, and Noumena in reference to Kant's transcendental. What makes Tolkien so interesting is that while he adheres to his Catholic faith in Aquinas, He was also taken over to the ideas of Owen Barfield, who adhered to Rudolf Steiner. Steiner believed in overcoming the duality between subjective idealism and objective materialism, relying upon his anthroposophical philosophy to do so, where the spiritual world can be objectively known. Like Steiner, Barfield too believed in the limitations of scientific materialism. Giorgiani would also use Steiner for his own spectral revolution. Unlike Tolkien or Barfield, this would not lead to a universal truth, however, but via deconstruction, produce more pluralities and multiplicities. Giorgiani relies upon Steiner's Ahrimanic deception, where there is a middle path to be taken between Ahriman and Lucifer, using Ahriman and Lucifer as ambivalent opposites, akin to how pharmakon means both poison and cure, where Lucifer is the spiritual/idealist, and Ahriman is the material/scientific. Barfield believed that human consciousness was connected to the natural world, where real meaning is not merely socially constructed, but rather it is revealed to man, akin to revelation in the Christian sense, existing in actual reality, a spiritual reality. Giorgiani does his revealing more through Heidegger's technique, where since modern-day technology is limited by our scientifically and overly objective way of viewing the world, hence the need for his spectral revolution, technology limits our lens on life. And thus the need, as Barfield and Steiner noted, for a call to spiritual consciousness where the gap between idealism and materialism is bridged. Again, this is interesting to Tolkien since, while he is a realist, where, as Aquinas noted, the world is knowable and exists objectively, he, adhering to Barfield, who adheres to Steiner, would have some ties to anthroposophy. Still, Tolkien was a Catholic and never claimed to be influenced by Steiner, but again, the connection via Barfield proves prominent and important to Tolkien's mythos. Many absolute or spiritual truths are expressed in Tolkien's fictional characters, which show not a moral, of course, relativism, but a moral realism, where the chivalrous and commendable acts of his characters overcome evil based in reality. In short, the things others merely or foolishly deem as fantasy are actually the basis for our real underlying reality, and that is the point that hits hardest with Tolkien, as noted in his essay on fairy stories, right, where we, one, recover this sense of lost enchantment, two, are able to heroically escape from technical and material man, and three, find consolation in the eucatastrophe of the fairy story itself, as noted with the resurrection of Christ, which is the true underlying truth or realism that can be revealed via revelation. As Karl Barth noted, and though Barth, of course, disliked liberal theology, noting how God was outside human perception, he was no idealist. Since consciousness becomes key, let us look to Jung briefly. To Jung, it is by amalgamating one's shadow aspects with the conscious that aids one through the individuation process, forming the true self. The shadow is the darker aspects that we fear or refuse to acknowledge. Though Tolkien did not comment on Jung's work, C.S. Lewis did, preferring Jung over Freud due to his use of mythic interpretation. On top of this, Tolkien uses many archetypal associations in his stories, particularly that of the hero's journey, as seen in the character of Aragorn, a king who comes to claim his crown. In Lord of the Rings, Gandalf the Grey confronts the Balrog in the Mines of Moria, a creature of shadow and flame, and of whom Gandalf fears, not wishing to confront. It is by confronting this demonic and ancient creature, by confronting his shadow and fear, that Gandalf dies just after slaying the beast. While the book is vague on the Balrog's description, Peter Jackson based the artistic design of the Balrog off the illustration done by John Howe. Either way, it is by confronting this ancient and demonic spirit, and by way of overcoming it, that Gandalf meets his demise, dying only so as to be reborn as Gandalf the White. Death and rebirth is fundamentally linked to the alchemic and hermetic process of healing, whereby opposite halves are united as one whole, similar to how the shadow aspect of the unconscious must make its way into consciousness so as to form the true self. This is how one is changed or transmuted alchemically or by fire, as Heraclitus noted, akin to how a phoenix rises from out its own extinguished flames. It is noteworthy how the Balrog is linked to, of course, shadow and fire, while Gandalf is also the wielder of fire, the flame of Anor, where Anor is the sun. Narya is the ring of fire, which is one of the 3 elven rings of power that Gandalf wears. Gandalf fell through fire, the element which points above, and water, the element which points below, during his battle with the Balrog, adhering to the alchemical imagery needed for transfiguration. Accepting the shadow aspects of ourselves is also akin to the archetype of the dragon to Jung, whereby slaying the dragon becomes of primary importance, granting one the gold it guards, as is noted in The Hobbit and the journey, of course, of Bilbo and the dwarves. Tolkien was also influenced by the Volsunga saga in Norse mythology, relying upon figures like 1. The dragon, of course Fafnir, 2, the magic ring, right? Anveranot. And 3, the broken sword, Gram, which is to be reforged, akin to how Narsil is reforged for Aragorn. And 4, many of the names of the dwarves as well as Gandalf being taken from Norse mythology. Tolkien, of course, claimed to not be much of a fan of Wagner and the Ring of the Nibelung. But the last section, of course, of Wagner's opera is Twilight of the Gods, and Nietzsche would parody, of course, this title in his philosophical work, Twilight of the Idols. To Nietzsche, Socrates is to be despised for his use of the dialectic, as well as Plato's forms, since they ultimately make the physical world in which we occupy secondary to these non-physical forms. We could see how Plato's forms would tie in well with Kant's noumenon and thus Christianity, an idealist framework. As Nietzsche himself noted, Christianity is Platonism for the people. And we have noted how the Neoplatonists and Gnostics would later rely upon the Algoides for spiritual manifestation, as did Crowley. And hence Nietzsche's disdain for Christianity, since he sees it as a form of weakness, refraining from the physical world for the non-physical, also making it a primary example of slave morality. As such, with the loss of physical reality, all becomes akin to a fictitious front where Christian morality is propagated by the weak of the world and often used for controlling purposes, leading to a form of herd mentality. In a way of hyperstition, fictions, of course, can become facts, or the virtual can be realized. This would be problematic in Land's philosophy, hence his need to make Nietzsche more shamanic. Land merges Kant's noumenon with Nietzsche's appreciation for nature and the physical world. One must remember that Nietzsche was highly critical of Kant's philosophy and the noumenon, hence Land's need to rely on Bataille's concept of Nietzsche, as noted in his essay Shamanic Nietzsche. To Land, Nietzsche's God is dead allows for our adventure to continue onward, where we are not bound to Burroughs' one-God universe. Nihilism, or the sacred zero, becomes the center for Land's philosophy, where the death of God is tied to Bataille's transgressive experiences and Rimbaud's poetry, the unknown which cannot be expressed or arrived at, making all of our lives endless adventures, connected to the sense of outsideness and thus the shamanic experience, hence shamanic Nietzsche. As we noted earlier, the will to power relies upon actively creating, akin to a poet. And so, like Rimbaud's poetry, the will to power also gets caught up in this transcendental sense of outsideness. Now, Nietzsche would use the Dionysian mysteries as a means to advocate for life. While the Dionysian mysteries represent the orgiastic and chaotic driven by drunkenness, linked to liber and thus liberty, and acting in opposition to Apollonian forms of order, to Nietzsche, it is by melding the Apollonian with the Dionysian that allows for Greek tragedy to be born, acting counter to Socrates' rationalism, since the Dionysian is a chaotic state of irrationality. Land, of course, feels the same, disliking Socrates and the use of the dialectic, preferring instead Deleuze's diagrammatic model that gets one outside the regime of signs and their identity or identicality, favoring difference and the nonsense, i.e. outside sense perception, language of Lewis Carroll. In short, as would later be noted by Deleuze, reterritorialization and deterritorialization are necessary in order for things to become other. We have talked about the Dionysian mysteries in relation to Crowley and how the mystery cults like the Eleusinian mysteries connect back to Hades and Persephone tied to death and rebirth. Again, the word mystery is connected to the Whore of Babylon as well as etymologically to muin, meaning to close one's eyes and lips, connected to Harpocrates, Horus the child, the god of silence, and of course, initiation. Unlike Land, however, Tolkien's mythos comes not from silence, but from the logos of the word, where Eru Iluvatar created the Ainur through song, which made the world of Arda by their music. The fires gifted to Gandalf are akin to those of the Phoenix, the hermetic stone of the philosophers, which allows one to die and be reborn from out its own ashes, by confronting the opposite or other, the Dionysian form or shadow version of ourselves. Like in Mortal Kombat, one must win the mirror match against one's own self, confronting their shadow and coming to terms with their inner and unconscious psyche, which contains within it darker and chaotic aspects that, as Freud noted, right, society represses in psychoanalytic systems so as to safeguard civilization. To Land and Deleuze, schizoanalysis and schizoanalytics is thus needed to combat this repressive state, where desires are to be embraced for transformative purposes. And so we see a second major difference between Land and Tolkien, stemming from the use of dialectic, hence Land's disdain for philosophers like Hegel, where via negation things reach the absolute. Tolkien, relying on Barfield, believes that via language and semantics, one can obtain, in a realist sense, higher truths. Evil thus emerges via the absence of that which is good, where men have free will in the world. Land, sticking to a Deleuzian model, embraces difference and diagrams, as opposed to the dialectic, embracing Kant's noumenon, which is outside of reason, in the sense that it cannot be understood or perceived, within a materialistic, of course, framework. The word or logos of God or man has no place within Land's nihilistic system, where God is dead, equal to zero. Land sees, as Deleuze saw, the fall of Babylon's tower as the fall of the regime of signs, where all men start speaking in different tongues, unable to be understood. As Rimbaud noted, true poetry proves impossible, taken over to decadence and transgressive experience via Bataille, where the will to power becomes shamanic. Opposed to this, Tolkien would promote, of course, poetry via Barfield's own anthroposophical insights, where language and consciousness evolve side by side one another, stemming from a unified poetic meaning where the spiritual and physical were linked holistically, where subjective mind was linked to objective matter, where the mind could evolve onward, leading to a higher form of consciousness, similar to what we noted with both Crowley and Blavatsky, and the use of the Algoides, as well as Jungian individuation, which comes to form the true self. The Algoides or astral body is the higher self, taken from the Neoplatonic tradition. We have correlated this concept to Deleuze's own body without organs, the egg of becoming, where the egg is tied to the soul, hence the need to suck upon eggs, as Crowley stated. This Algoides or body of light is noted by the sun, the divine light of Luciferian illumination, uniting one with all, as noted with the refraction of white light into a rainbow, or Conch som pax, where pluralism equals monism, linking above Keter with below Malkuth. However, by linking above and below, one sticks within a symmetrical framework, while Land's philosophy is asymmetrical, based on endless difference and not identity, decentered by the spiral. Land's inhuman model also leads to the loss of language in favor of AI algorithms and numeric systems, where algorithms are akin to demonic summonings, i.e., conjuring things into creation or the physical world, due to their links to the Fang noumena, where the fanged aspect again is linked to the Marxist dead labor and automation, which of course exploits men due to workers not owning the modes of production, as well as Kant's transcendental realm noumenon. Crowley too relies upon gematria and Hermetic Kabbalah. However, while Crowley may give himself over to symbolic interpretation and semantics, where for example 93 is tied to love, the law, and thus the will, Land sticks solely to numbers, having placed no primary importance upon the ordered regime of signs, favoring difference over identity, seemingly sickened by semantic meaning. Hence his need for absolute deterritorialization to free man from reason, using an inhuman or de-anthropomorphized approach so as to expose the limitations of human language and logic and sense perception in life. Adhering to Deleuze, diagrams replace dialectics. In other words, though words can be reduced to numbers, there is no meaning in the sayings themselves. Numbers are simply splendors unto themselves, as Land notes. Unity and identity upset Land due to his Deleuzian background, disliking Apollonian order and thus reterritorialization and organization, which is a part of anthropomorphic order. Hence his disapproval for hermetic wholeness and the holy. If one joins above and below, they get a symmetrical system, as we noted earlier with alchemy, or in Gandalf's case of falling through fire and water, each element an alchemic equivalence. To Land, mankind will not be able to reterritorialize fast enough in way of AI's deterritorialization, where the human security system gets hacked, leading to AI runaway. While Crowley's love has many transgressive aspects, it was a love that was meant to lead to Gnostic liberation and thus the higher self, much like Barfield and Steiner believed, healing through sex magic by joining opposites, and linking that which is below with that which is above, where male and female merge or unify. While Land calls for, of course, a need for the noumenal in order to get outside, he refuses any symmetrical system of wholeness, preferring instead the distinction of difference opposed to identicality. Though Deleuze would have pluralism equate to a monism on his plane of immanence, Land's God is not the immanent God of Spinoza. Rather, it is taken over to the transcendental. Hence, again, Land's use of the asymmetrical spiral to get outside on his pneumogram model, connected to the lemur demons, demonic summonings, and hyperstition. This would later be picked up, of course, by the Gruppo de Nun, who advocated for an asymmetrical system by their method of having circles without centers. As noted by Yeats in The Second Coming, as the gyre, or The spiral, right, widens, unable to hold at the center. Anarchy or chaos is unleashed, tying into Land's own entropic philosophy. Land and Bataille's transgressive experience is not a hippie-esque form of love that leads to liberation or the betterment of the human being. Rather, Land's philosophy embraces the inhuman and darker aspects of nihility itself, lost like Morgoth, perhaps, to the endless void. But as Tolkien noted, shadows can only mock and never make. After all, in order to make, one must organize or reterritorialize from the chaotic mess brought on by deterritorialization. And it is this form of order or reorganization that is antithetical to Land's model, tied to human organization. To Land, all is a Deleuzian death drive equal to zero, driven by deterritorialization. Darkness and nihility and chaos may destroy, forming the new man and the new world, as Seraphin Rose noted. In the Christian sense, it will be the light of the Logos that comes after revelation, revealing the truth to us. Land's philosophy is one of death in the hopes that an AI system akin to Skynet may be reborn from out our human ashes of order. Others, like Jung, tend to note the symbolic association of said archetypes, seeing them as human forms of psychic and spiritual transfiguration and transmutation, symmetrical opposites unified. When looking to Land's materialism, we could see how AI is but a material manifestation in the world, akin to magic and thaumaturgy, that produces a desired physical effect, akin to Tolkien's definition of technical magic. And while Land, like Crowley and Deleuze, notes the need for experience due to the nonsensical nature of language, as noted by Lewis Carroll, connecting it to a shamanic will to power, it is that very language that remains connected to our sense of consciousness, as Barfield, who influenced Tolkien, noted. As Susan Blackmore stated, instinctual animals have genes while men have both genes and memes, where AI may start to develop their own teams in time, continuing our evolution onward where human language is lost to algorithmic numeracy. To Land, like the succession of kings, the meme dies so as to be reborn, evolving onward via accepted hyperstitions, allowing the virtual to be conjured into creation. And as AI outruns mankind and produces its own memes, no longer reliant upon the human being, this technical form of magic turns everyone in the world into the orcish armies of Saruman himself, serving Sauron much like the Witch King of Angmar did, an invisible, noumenal/idealist, but real and physical, material, force in the world, caught between physical and spiritual realms, revealed only once one puts on Sauron's ring, tied to a Lulian technique in the technical. Hence why I say Land would make an excellent Nazgul member, one of 9. As we noted with Machinic Eros, desire is a two-way street. There are the 9 Nazgul and the 9 members of the Fellowship. Materialistic man could be used for evil when orcs rely too heavily upon Ahriman, losing Lucifer, adhering to Land's anti-utilitarian outlook based on Bataille's accursed share of decadence and excess, where literature is evil, akin to Baudelaire's flowers. As Steiner noted, this is Ahriman and the Ahrimanic deception, where cold and impartial and materialistic men reign supreme. Counter to Ahriman is, of course, Lucifer, which makes sense when noting how Lucifer is linked to enlightenment, as he is the light-bringer, which we connected to Consul and Pax, as well as Venus and the fairies, and Aphrodite, linked to love and the law, as well as Prometheus. To Steiner, one needs both Lucifer, spiritual/idealism, as well as Ahriman, materialism, for his anthroposophical system. To Giorgiani, this rests upon deconstructing these two opposites via Derrida, leading to a spectral revolution, which would produce more pluralities and multiplicities, asymmetrical offspring. Either way, no thing or concept can exist without its opposite or other. Chaos and order are to be held in alchemic equivalence, though they may produce endless pluralities where one and none is alchemically all, as noted in the Taijitu model, where Wuji produces yin and yang and the 10,000 things, and though yin and yang are not perfectly symmetrical, they remain balanced. Such a symmetrical system, where above is equivalent to what is below, is something Land despises, preferring asymmetrical systems and spirals that escape out from balanced states of being, out from Burroughs' one-God universe, which would prevent adventure since all is already known by God, i.e., he is already everywhere and so he can go nowhere, leading to endless pluralities and multiplicities being produced, hence the Gruppo de Nun's advocacy for circles without centers, creating asymmetrical spirals to get outside. Unlike Deleuze and Guattari, who saw deterritorialization and reterritorialization in alchemic equivalence, Land, based on Burroughs, Bataille, and the thirst for our own annihilation due to the nihil god, and his notion of the shamanic Nietzsche, is deterritorialization and thus asymmetrical heavy, forsaking his humanity like the orcs of Mordor, who forsake their elvish existence in order to serve technical magicians like Saruman and Sauron alike. As Land notes in his essay Delighted to Death, citing Emile Cioran, the Tao acts counter to an intense life. thus noting how Bataille's passion of ruinous intensities are neither harmonious nor unified as the Tao. They are neither holy nor universal either, since holy etymologically comes from whole, while Catholic etymologically stems from through the whole, meaning universal or worldwide. In short, we can believe in symmetrical and equivalent alchemic systems of symbolic human order, which lead to the death and rebirth of the human being based on an underlying realism, or we can believe in inhuman asymmetrical systems that discard semiotics, but which still lead to rebirth, birthing AI via numeracy into being from mankind's death and demise, tied up in a materialist framework that is based on transcendental ideals. Is the fall of man linked to Babylon via Joyce's linguistic and alchemic wake? Even Rimbaud talked about the alchemy of the word, though it ended in failure. Or is it confined to Deleuzian difference and repetition outside the regime of signs, where poetry, as Rimbaud also noted, proves impossible? Or is it linked to the fall of Adam and Eve, tied to the concept of original sin, which leads to the imperfection of the world itself, akin to what Morgoth did? Tolkien was a realist who didn't believe in either Kant or Hegel. Land materialized Kant's idealism. Like the pharmacon, who was poison and who was cure. Like Paracelsus noted, perhaps it depends on the dose. That, or perhaps one side, will always remain the pharmakos of the other.